First, the accounts of Jesus' birth. As it turns out, only 2 of our 4 Gospels of the New Testament narrate the events of Jesus' birth. Both Mark and John begin with Jesus as an adult. It's Matthew and Luke that give us the stories of Jesus' birth. Both stories agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, even though he came from Nazareth. And both agree that his mother was a virgin when she gave birth. But the differences between Matthew and Luke's accounts are striking and worth noting. For my undergraduate class, I have my students do an exercise. I have them read through the Gospel of Matthew and make a simple list. I tell them list everything that happens in Matthew's Gospel in chapters 1 and 2, and then read Luke chapters 1 and 2 and make a list of everything that happens in Luke, and then compare your lists. It's striking that Matthew and Luke, even though they have broad similarities, Jesus born in Bethlehem but from Nazareth, their details are different from one another up and down the line. These lists end up being radically different, and in fact different in ways that show that it's impossible, in fact, to reconcile some of the differences. In the Gospel of Matthew, we're told that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and that his father is given a revelation that Mary is a virgin and she'll conceive and bear a child. He's born in Bethlehem, and after the birth, these wise men come from the east. The wise men who are following a star. The star leads them to Jerusalem and stops over Jerusalem. So they go into Jerusalem to inquire, where is the King of the Jews to be born? Word gets out to King Herod that these wise men are looking for this child. He calls in the Jewish interpreters of the law, and they tell him that the King of the Jews is to be born in Bethlehem. And so the word gets related to the wise men, and then the star reappears magically in the sky, and they follow the star to Bethlehem, and it stops over the house that Jesus is in. They go in, they worship him with gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and then they leave. But they're warned in a dream not to go back through Jerusalem because Herod is out to kill the child, and so they return another way. Herod finds out that he's been deceived. He sends out the troops. They slaughter all the children 2 years and under in Bethlehem. But Joseph has been warned in a dream that this is to happen, and so he takes the child and his mother, and they flee to Egypt. And they set up shop in Egypt until King Herod dies. Then they return home. But they can't return to Bethlehem because now Archelaus is the ruler of Judea, and so Joseph decides to relocate his family up in the north, in Galilee, in the village of Nazareth. That's Matthew's account. Now, when you read Matthew's account, you wonder, well, there are some things missing. What about the shepherds that visited Jesus when he was born? What about the census that led them from Nazareth to Bethlehem so that everybody had to be... Where are these other parts? Well, they're in Luke. They're not in Matthew. Luke's gospel is quite different. According to Luke's gospel, the entire world is to be taxed, and Caesar Augustus has, for a census for Caesar Augustus. And so everybody has to return to his ancestral home. Joseph is from the lineage of David, King David, who lived 1,000 years earlier. And so Joseph has to register for this tax in Bethlehem, which is where David was from. And so Joseph goes to Bethlehem, and he takes with him his betrothed Mary, who, while they're in Bethlehem, suddenly birth pangs come upon her, and she gives birth. So that Jesus then is born in Bethlehem. There's no room in the inn. It's outside in a grotto or a cave or a stable. They lay him in a manger, and then the shepherds come and visit him. The Holy Family then stays in Jerusalem until the rites of purification can be performed. According to the Old Testament, the Torah, the woman who's given birth is ritually impure for 32 days, after which she's to perform a sacrifice in the temple, which will bring purification. They perform the sacrifice, then they return to Nazareth. It's interesting to compare the two accounts because there are different things in the different accounts. There's wise men in one, there's shepherds in the other. There's appearances of angels to Joseph in Matthew, appearances of angels to Mary in Luke, etc. And there are historical problems with both accounts. For example, the star that's leading these wise men to Jesus. How exactly is this star working? The star stops over Jerusalem and apparently disappears. Then it shows up again, leads them to Bethlehem, and stops over the house. How exactly does a star stop over a house? I asked my students to go outside and look up at the stars and tell me which house that star is standing over. So it must be some kind of miraculous star. The funniest portrayal of this, by the way, is in Monty Python's Life of Brian, where the wise men are following the star, and they go in the wrong house because they aren't sure which house it's over, and they go into Brian's house instead of Jesus' house until they realize they made a mistake, and they have to go back and retrieve their gold, frankincense, and myrrh and take it to the right place. Luke's account is also problematic historically. The idea that there was a census, that the entire world had to be taxed and everybody had to return to their ancestral home, how does that work exactly? Joseph returns to Bethlehem because his ancestor from 1,000 years earlier was born there. Let's suppose George W. goes back on his campaign promises and he decides we all need to be taxed. And the way this new tax is going to work is we're all going to return to our ancestral home. So you have to go back to where your ancestors were from 1,000 years ago to register for this tax. Where are you going to go? So anyway, so Luke assumes that this is what's happening. And the other thing is the entire empire is doing this. The entire empire is going back to register for this tax to their ancestral homes. And there's no mention of it in any author from the ancient world except for Luke. It's like this happening in the modern day and it not making it into the newspapers. Well, probably there wasn't a census. So why does Luke say there was a census? Because Luke knows that Jesus came from Nazareth, but he has to get him born in Bethlehem. Well, how did he get born in Bethlehem? Well, there was the census, you see, and everybody had to return to their ancestral home. Matthew also knows that Jesus came from Nazareth and has him born in Bethlehem, but he does it differently. There's not a census. In Matthew, Joseph and Mary are from Bethlehem. When the wise men come, they've been following the star for a long time because Herod kills every boy 2 years and under. If Jesus was born yesterday, they wouldn't have to kill toddlers to make sure. They would know that a newborn isn't wandering around in the yard. Jesus is in a house in Bethlehem. When they escape to Egypt, they come back. Where do they want to return? To Bethlehem. They can't return there because Archelaus is the ruler. So they relocate in Nazareth. So he's born in Bethlehem, but raised in Nazareth. Both Matthew and Luke agree on that, but they do it in different ways. And the ways of doing it are discrepant. Because if Matthew is right that they fled to Egypt, how can Luke be right that after 32 days they returned to Nazareth? You see, there's no time for the flight to Egypt. Since the flight wouldn't be on a plane, they'd have to walk, and it would take a while. In any event, these are two very different events. When people take the gospel stories then and put them together into the birth story that's told every December, what they're doing is taking Matthew, taking Luke, and smashing them together into one story. But to do that, you have to leave out parts of both because they can't be reconciled.